Hello and welcome to the special series World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. Now, communication, discourse and diplomacy are the hallmarks of a civilization. And war, a synonym for destruction, is rarely a solution to any problem. Now, the question, of course, is why do nations, communities and individuals invest so much in conflict? Who are the ideologues of wars, big and comparatively small, that rage across the globe? In this edition of World at War, we take you to the heart of the conflict zones that have dominated the world headlines, and also to those conflicts that have remained under the radar of the media glare. We explain what is happening and explore why it is happening, the why question behind each human bonfire. In the Horn of Africa, Somalia's dreaded Al-Shabaab group stormed an African Union military base in the El Baraf village on the 3rd of May. At least about 10 Burundian peacekeepers were killed in this terror attack, while 5 others are said to be missing. In a forgotten corner of Australia, violence broke out between the rival Aboriginal clans due to the cramped and very poor living conditions. The irony is, Australia is one of the richest nations in the world, but the living conditions of the Aboriginal people has been a source of constant flare-ups. In Myanmar, the government launched airstrike raids upon its own citizens in the Kain state near the Thai border. Why? Because the government is an army junta that came to power through a coup against an elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. In Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, thousands of people took to the streets earlier this month, demanding the immediate ouster of their incumbent Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan. The opposition parties have accused the Prime Minister of plotting to cede all the territories of the contested Nagorno-Karabakh region to the old enemy of Armenia, Azerbaijan, over which the two countries have fought 2 wars in the last 30 years. North Korea has test-fired yet another ballistic missile, its 15th since the beginning of 2022. Kim Jong-un has vowed to bolster his nuclear arsenal at the fastest pace possible. Remember, all this is happening at a time when there's been a change of guard at Seoul. But let's start this episode with a street protest in Sri Lanka that have shaken up the political fabric of the island nation. Conflict is not the sole prerogative of adversary nations. Equally often, people in a country, driven to desperation by a government that has misused power, rise up in protests, for they see no other option. The people of Sri Lanka, enraged and desperate as they watch their economy crumble around them, have just one demand. They want President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to go, and they want him to go immediately. Their fury as a trapped president hangs on to office to save his skin has led to a mass uprising in Sri Lanka. For several weeks now, chants of Gota go home have reverberated on the streets of the picturesque island nation. In his latest address to the nation, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has offered to form a unity government. He's also appointed a new Prime Minister in Ranil Wickremesinghe. He's promised to give up most of his executive powers and bring in sweeping reforms to Sri Lanka's political system. But none of these promises have assuaged the anger of the protesters. Violence erupted on the 9th of May when supporters of Mahinda Rajapaksa, after a meeting at his residence in Colombo, went out into the city and attacked the protesters with iron rods. If this was a strategy to disperse the protesters, then it spectacularly backfired. The violence of Rajapaksa's supporters enraged the protesters further, who are demanding for his resignation. This sparked countrywide clashes. Such was the rage amongst the protesters that they even set Mahinda Rajapaksa's home on fire. At least 41 homes and properties belonging to the leaders of the ruling party have been attacked and torched. At least 9 people are said to have been killed so far and 200 others have been injured. Eventually, to placate the protesters, Mahinda Rajapaksa, remember, was forced to step down from his position as the Prime Minister. The once strongman leader of Sri Lanka had to be airlifted to safety and is said to be in hiding along with his family at the Trincomalee Naval Base. Tanks are out on the streets in a bid to maintain order. But the crisis is so deep and the rot of a corruption-infested system so dire that any fixes attempted by Gotabaya Rajapaksa look cosmetic and have been rejected by the people. The acute shortage of food has plagued Sri Lanka for the last several weeks, and it has only worsened in these last few weeks. Power cuts last for well over 13 hours a day, while fuel rationing has become the new norm. As a step to get some relief from the IMF, Gotabaya Rajapaksa decided to devalue the Sri Lankan rupee in the month of March. What was meant as a remedial step has resulted in the collapse of the purchasing power of the Sri Lankan middle class. Food inflation that was hovering at a terrible 30% in the month of March has now shot up to 45% in the month of May. Consider this, a litre of milk now costs a staggering 266 Sri Lankan rupees. A litre of coconut oil now costs a painful 850 Sri Lankan rupees, while a single egg in Sri Lanka will set you back by 30 Lankan rupees. The average salary of a Sri Lankan household is just a little under 90,000 Lankan rupees. At first glance, this may sound like a lot, but in dollar terms, this is less than $300 for an entire household for a month. It is this crisis of not being able to purchase everyday essential items that has pushed the Sri Lankan people out of their homes and onto the streets. For several weeks, the protests had remained very peaceful. The people wanted Gotabaya Rajapaksa to go home, but Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who had earned his reputation as the defence minister of Sri Lanka back in 2009, crushing the Tamil insurgency and also stamping out the LTT leadership, is not someone who would willingly step down. The question, of course, now is, will Gotabaya Rajapaksa resort to oppression to deal with the protests of the hungry stomachs? Hypocrisy seems to be yet another characteristic of war. The biggest drumbeats on behalf of Ukraine have come in from Boris Johnson, who has been urging the rest of the world to cut off all imports from Russia. But what is interesting is that Britain itself has not stopped its import of Russian coal. Just last month, 130,000 tons of Russian coal arrived at a port in Lincolnshire on a ship that was flying a Greek flag. The ship may not have been Russian, but the coal most definitely was. From the beginning of the war, there's been a consensus that to stop the Russian war machine, Europe must stop importing the Russian hydrocarbons. There's been a lot of talk on this issue, but very little action. The question, of course, is why has Europe not been able to stop the import of Russian oil and gas?
Russia is the world's third largest producer of crude oil, behind only the United States and Saudi Arabia. On an average, each day, Russia exports a staggering 5 million barrels of oil to the outside world. And more than half of this is imported by neighboring Europe. Till the beginning of the Ukraine war, this trade was mutually beneficial. Russia enjoyed the brimming oil profits, while Europe was guaranteed a reliable and cheap source of energy from next door. Europe paid and still pays $1 billion every single day to import Russian hydrocarbons. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls this blood money. The only Western power to impose a complete ban on Russian oil is the United States. But then, Russian oil was just 3% of America's oil requirement. Britain relies on Russia to meet 8% of its oil requirement. Boris Johnson describes Russian oil as the addiction of Europe. But he is still to announce a halt on this import. Britain appears as addicted to Russian oil as anyone else. All that Downing Street has done so far is to produce a blueprint to phase out Russian oil by the end of this year, by which time the conflict is expected to be long over. Germany is in the most difficult position. It imports 34% of its oil and 65% of its gas from Russia. But the German Chancellor stood with the British Prime Minister at Downing Street and announced this.
We are actively working to get independent from the import of oil, and we think that we will be able to make it during this year. And we are actively working to get independent from the necessity of importing gas from Russia.
The announcement was bold. Germany made its intention clear, but the details remained fuzzy. Meanwhile, the Western economists have sounded a dire warning. An embargo on Russian oil could potentially tank the world economy. Soon enough, the German Chancellor was forced to rethink his commitment. He defended his volte-face by saying that avoiding an embargo on Russian gas meant avoiding a dramatic financial crisis, the loss of millions of jobs and of factories that would never open again. According to projections, if Berlin spurns Russian gas, the German economy will lose a staggering $240 billion. Or about 6.5% of its gross domestic product within the next 2 years, sparking off a sharp recession in Europe's largest economy, with knock-on effects on the rest of Europe. For the first time since the 1970s, there is talk about rationing oil and gas in Europe. This would mean Europeans will be asked to drive less, turn down their air conditioning, and work from home 3 days a week. Crude oil breaching $200 per barrel has become a very real possibility. In stark terms, the cost of defending Ukraine is simply too high for Germany and the rest of Europe. The Biden administration, too, has performed a diplomatic somersault. It has reached out to Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, to offset the price of gas that has got kicked up to $4.4 per gallon. Paradoxically, higher oil prices play into Russian hands. An embargo on Russian oil by Europe will not halt the Ukraine war. Instead, it will rewrite the global energy business. It will plunge Europe into a decade of recession. While Russia, due to the higher energy prices and new markets in Asia and Africa, will remain relatively unaffected. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Pakistan was stunned when a suicide bomber killed 3 Chinese nationals and also a Pakistani driver of a minibus, in which the Chinese nationals were travelling at the entrance of the China-sponsored Confucius Institute at the Karachi University. There are many startling aspects of this incident. The burqa-clad suicide bomber Shari Baloch, who blew herself up, was a 31-year-old woman. She was a postgraduate in zoology. She had reportedly become a member of the Baloch Liberation Army from her student days. Interestingly, she had no criminal record. She taught science to school students, and she was a mother of 2 young children. And her husband posted this picture of their family after the suicide bombing. This is the first time that the BLA has deployed a woman on a suicide mission against the Chinese presence in Balochistan. China is generally seen as the most reliable friend and an economic godfather of the Pakistani people, rather than as the enemy by most Pakistanis. So the question, of course, is, why were these Chinese nationals targeted? To understand this, one needs to understand the crisis that is unfolding in Balochistan. For decades, there's been a long-running insurgency in the largest of the Pakistani province. Many Baloch leaders claim that this is their war of independence, to secede from Pakistan. Things have gotten worse since the 2006 killing of the Baloch tribal leader Akbar Bukti on the orders of the military general turned president Pervez Musharraf. For decades, the Pakistani authorities have picked up Baloch activists who have subsequently disappeared. It is believed that they were tortured and killed by the Pakistani army. In this latest incident, the suicide bomber was waiting for the minibus that was ferrying the 3 Chinese nationals Huang Jiuping, the director of the Confucius Institute, and two other Chinese staff members, Ding Mufang and Chen Sai. As the minibus slowed down to enter into the premises, Shari Baloch detonated the bomb she had on her person. The driver of the van, a Pakistani national called Khalid, was also killed. Immediately after the blast, the Baloch Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the attack, describing Shari Baloch as a member of their Majid Brigade and as someone who had volunteered for the suicide mission about 2 years ago. Women suicide bombers are very rare. Pakistani officials have recorded only about 4 other such instances. Balochistan happens to be Pakistan's largest but its poorest province. It is rich in natural resources, but the Baloch people feel exploited by the Chinese acting in collusion with the non-Baloch establishment of Islamabad. They feel that their natural wealth is being stolen. The $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor is seen as the principal vehicle of economic exploitation, and China as the mainstay of Pakistani occupation. This has brought the Chinese nationals working in Pakistan in the direct crosswires of the Baloch Liberation Army. The Confucius Institute is seen as a symbol of China's cultural and political hegemony. The Baloch Liberation Army has been involved in a spate of attacks targeting the Chinese interests in Pakistan. For instance, in 2018, 3 BLA suicide attackers had stormed inside the Chinese consulate in Karachi, killing 2 policemen and wounding a security guard. In 2019, 3 BLA gunmen attacked a 5-star hotel in Gwadar and killed 1 security guard. In 2024, BLA attackers armed with guns and grenades stormed the Karachi Stock Exchange and killed 2 guards and a policeman. In February 2022, the BLA claimed to have killed more than 100 Pakistani soldiers in Balochistan's Panjgur and Noshki districts. The 2022 attack occurred when the former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan was in Beijing to reassure the Chinese people that their investments and the Chinese nationals working in Pakistan were safe. But it is not just the Baloch Liberation Army, because in July 2021, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, an affiliate of the Afghan Taliban, was responsible for the killing of the 9 Chinese workers near the Dasu Dam. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor connects Kashgar in the Xinjiang province to the Gwadar port in Balochistan. China's oppression of the Uyghur minority Muslims hasn't won China any friends inside of Pakistan, even if the government in Islamabad has maintained an uneasy silence on the oppression of the Uyghur minority Muslims in order to protect its relationship with Beijing. What has made matters worse is the resentment expressed by the local people at the Gwadar port, a virtual Chinese port city. Tens of thousands of locals rallied against the Chinese presence in Gwadar in December last year. The locals have accused the Chinese fishing trawlers operating in the Baloch waters as stealing their livelihoods. Thoughtful voices in Pakistan now openly say that their country has been reduced to an economic colony of Beijing. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, once hyped as an economic game changer, has now become a death trap for Pakistan and a political lightning rod for those who want Baloch liberation. Somalia is once again trapped between the worst drought in decades and a deadly insurgency waged by the Al-Shabaab terror group. In the latest bout of continuing violence, militants from the Islamist terror group Al-Shabaab stormed an African Union military base located in the remote El-Baraf village, about 160 kilometers northeast of the capital Mogadishu. The assault took place in the wee hours of the morning of the 3rd of May, just a day after the Eid al-Fitr festivities in Somalia. Al-Shabaab claims that it carried out twin suicide bombings, and the ensuing gunfight lasted for well over an hour. There are conflicting reports of casualties. Now, Al-Shabaab claims to have killed at least about 170 soldiers who were stationed at this peacekeeping base. It also claims to have captured an unknown number of soldiers as prisoners of war. But the fact is, the Islamist group often inflates the death toll suffered by its enemies in order to boost its own reputation. Burundi's army, however, has said that it has lost just 10 of its soldiers, while 5 are still said to be missing. This is one of the biggest attacks by Al-Shabaab in recent years. It's also the first attack since ATMIS replaced the earlier African Union mission in Somalia that was called AMISOM. The head of the United States Africa Command, General Stephen Townsend, has described Al-Shabaab as the greatest threat on the African continent that can potentially strike American targets even outside of Africa. The name Al-Shabaab means the youth in Arabic. Formed in the late 1990s and driven by the ideology of extreme Wahhabism, its goal is to establish a strict Islamic state in the Horn of Africa by expelling all outside forces. Al-Shabaab came into prominence in the 2006 war, when neighboring Ethiopia had invaded into Somalia and ousted the government that was formed by the Islamic Courts Union. Resistance against the Ethiopian invasion helped Al-Shabaab to grow from a group of just few hundred people to a well-organized and well-funded militia of almost about 8,000 to 12,000 fighters. In 2011, Al-Shabaab was pushed out of Mogadishu with the combined African Union forces. In 2012, Al-Shabaab pledged allegiance to the Al-Qaeda terror network. For more than a decade, Al-Shabaab has waged a deadly insurgency against the Western-backed federal Somali government, whose control is limited to the urban centers of the country. Though it faces a stiff resistance from the Western-backed government, Al-Shabaab still controls large swathes of rural southern Somalia. The military presence of the United States in Somalia resumed in 2007 with the deployment of troops in small numbers. The mandate for the American troops was fairly straightforward. They had to train the local forces and provide them with air support through conventional fighter jets or through drones to keep the Islamist forces at bay. But one of the last acts of Donald Trump as the President of the United States of America in 2020 was to order the pullout of all American troops from Somalia. Amidst the drama of President Donald Trump's departure from the White House, this decision was barely noticed. But to Somalia, this was tantamount to being abandoned in its war against terrorism. Many analysts now say that Al-Shabaab is now bigger, stronger and bolder than ever. War is merciless and death comes easy in the battlefield. Innocent civilians are just as much in danger as combatants are. And journalists who cover wars and conflicts sometimes end up paying the ultimate price for their duty. War correspondents put their skin into the rugged crucible of a conflict. It is the job of a conflict correspondent to capture the terrible violence and to narrate about the shattered lives of the people who are caught in the horrors of a conflict zone. But sometimes, journalists themselves end up becoming the story. Shireen Abu Akleh, a 51-year-old Palestinian-American woman journalist, born in Jerusalem, was a household name and face across the Arab world. She was the first woman correspondent of the Qatar-based channel, who through a commanding and meticulous reportage had brought the stories of war and conflict from the occupied Palestinian territories. On the 11th of May, the veteran journalist was shot dead with a bullet in her face. The channel that she worked for has described her killing as a clear-cut case of cold-blooded murder. Shireen Abu Akleh was doing her job. She was documenting the terrible details of a raid by the Israeli forces in the Palestinian city of Jenin. Another journalist, Ali Al-Samoudi, was also wounded by a bullet in the back, but is now said to be in a stable condition. Arab leaders, including the Emir of Qatar, have squarely blamed the Israelis for Shireen's killing. Now, the Emir of Qatar has called for accountability on those who have perpetrated this murder. The Israelis have denied having any motive to kill Shireen Abu Akleh, but they've agreed for a joint investigation. But the horrific killing of Shireen Abu Akleh highlights the dangers the journalists throw themselves into while covering war and conflict. In just the occupied Palestinian territories, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Information, at least 45 journalists have been killed since 2000. In the ongoing war in Ukraine, at least 23 journalists have been killed so far, 7 while they were on assignment. In Mexico, at least about 11 journalists have been killed while documenting the violence of the gang wars since the beginning of 2022. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least about 2,150 journalists and media workers have been killed in the last 30 years across the world just for doing their jobs. War spares no one who enters a war zone. And for war correspondents, telling the story of people caught in a war zone can sometimes come at a very heavy price. Religion, as has often been said, has been a cause of continuous conflict throughout recorded history. To be clear, God does not start wars, but men start wars in God's name. So when an effort is made by the high priests of different faiths to try and ease tensions, search for common values, and also find a way towards harmony, this becomes news. On the 11th of May of this month, a conference was held in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, where the faith leaders from different parts of the world gathered to expand understanding, to minimize conflict, and also to establish common ground.